The morning air carried a crisp bite that made every breath feel sharp and clean. Golden sunlight filtered through the oak trees lining the park pathway, creating dancing patterns of light and shadow on the worn asphalt. John Cena's powerful strides matched the steady rhythm of his breathing as he pushed through his third mile. Beside him, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson maintained his own punishing pace, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. "You're slowing down, brother," Dwayne called out, shooting a sideways grin at his training partner. Sweat glistened on both men's foreheads, despite the cool morning temperature. John smirked, wiping moisture from his brow with the back of his hand. "I'm letting you have your moment. Wouldn't want to bruise that ego this early in the morning." Their friendly banter had become a ritual during these dawn runs through Riverside Park. The familiar competition pushed both men to their limits, but more than that, these morning sessions provided something neither expected to need: peace. In a world where their every move was scrutinized, where cameras followed their daily lives, this simple act of running offered precious solitude. The park buzzed with early morning activity around them. Dog walkers navigated the winding paths, with eager pets straining against their leashes. Elderly couples strolled hand in hand, pointing out blooming flowers and commenting on the weather. Young mothers pushed strollers while juggling coffee cups and phone calls. Children's laughter echoed from the playground in the distance, mixing with the gentle splash of the ornamental fountain. Everything felt normal, peaceful, perfectly ordinary. Dwayne chuckled, shaking his head as they picked up their pace. Their powerful legs carried them forward in synchronized motion, years of athletic training evident in every step. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the pathway and warming the air around them. John's breathing remained steady as his mind wandered. These runs had become more than exercise. They were therapy. The repetitive motion, the burn in his muscles, the simple goal of putting one foot in front of the other. It all helped clear his head of the endless pressures and responsibilities that came with fame. As they rounded a gentle curve in the path, passing a cluster of park benches, surrounded by carefully maintained flower beds, John felt that familiar sense of contentment that came with physical exertion. His body was strong, his mind clear, and the day stretched ahead with promise. But then he saw her. A small figure sat on a weathered wooden bench about 50 yards ahead. At first glance, she appeared to be just another child enjoying the morning with a family member. She wore a bright yellow dress that should have made her look cheerful, and her hair was neatly braided with colorful ribbons. She couldn't have been older than 9 or 10. Yet something about her posture made John's step falter slightly. She sat too still, too rigid, as if every muscle in her small body was locked in place by invisible chains. Her shoulders were drawn up tight, her back perfectly straight, and her hands rested motionlessly in her lap. Most children her age would be fidgeting, swinging their legs, looking around with natural curiosity. This girl sat like a statue. Beside her on the bench sat a large man in a dark winter coat that seemed too heavy for the mild morning temperature. Sunglasses covered his eyes despite the gentle lighting, and he held an open newspaper in front of his face. His posture appeared relaxed, casual even, but something about him sent an uncomfortable prickle down John's spine. The contrast was stark and unsettling. The man's deliberate indifference against the girl's obvious tension created a discordant note in the peaceful morning symphony. John's instincts, honed by years of reading people and situations, began sending warning signals he couldn't ignore. As they drew closer, John's eyes met the girl's. She didn't blink, didn't look away, didn't react in any normal way a child might when noticing strangers approaching. She simply stared back with wide, unblinking eyes that held an intensity far too mature for someone so young. Her lips were slightly parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. John felt Dwayne's questioning glance as his own pace unconsciously slowed. Something was wrong here, fundamentally wrong, though he couldn't yet put his finger on exactly what. The girl continued to stare directly at him, and John realized she wasn't just looking, she was waiting. Waiting for someone to notice her, to really see her, to understand something she couldn't voice aloud. And then she did something that made John's blood run cold and his breath catch in his throat. With movements so subtle they might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying careful attention, She curled her thumb into her palm and folded her fingers over it, creating a small, almost imperceptible fist. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it hit John like a physical blow. His stomach dropped as recognition flooded his mind. He had seen that signal before in awareness campaigns, in interviews with police officers who specialized in rescuing kidnapped children. It was a silent cry for help, a desperate plea that could easily be mistaken for nervousness or fidgeting. But John knew better. This little girl in her bright yellow dress was asking for help in the only way she dared. John's pace slowed dramatically as the realization crashed over him like ice water. His mind raced, processing what he had just witnessed, while his training partner noticed a sudden change in rhythm. "You see that?" John muttered under his breath, his voice tight with sudden tension. Dwayne followed his gaze, frowning as he took in the scene on the bench. "See what?" "The girl. She just made a signal." The words hung in the air between them as they continued their approach. Dwayne's expression shifted from confusion to concern as he looked more carefully at the child. Her small hands were now folded motionless in her lap, but the fear in her dark eyes remained unmistakable. John's mind flashed back to the awareness campaigns he had participated in, the conversations with law enforcement officials who had shared stories that haunted him for weeks afterward. The hand signal for help was simple, subtle, and devastating in its implications. Curl your thumb into your palm, fold your fingers over it, and hope someone recognizes the desperate plea hidden in plain sight. Most people wouldn't notice. Most people would assume it was nothing more than a nervous gesture, a child fidgeting while waiting. But John had seen it, recognized it, and now he couldn't unknow what it meant. As they drew parallel with the bench, the man suddenly shifted. The newspaper in his hands rustled as he folded it with deliberate, practiced movements. He stood up slowly, his large frame unfolding with fluid precision, and reached for the girl's wrist. His grip appeared gentle to any casual observer, firm but not forceful enough to draw unwanted attention from passers-by. The girl barely resisted. There was only the slightest hesitation, a momentary tensing of her small shoulders before she allowed herself to be pulled upright. Her compliance wasn't the natural obedience of a child with a trusted family member. It was the learned submission of someone who had discovered that resistance brought consequences she couldn't bear. John and Dwayne stopped walking entirely, exchanging glances that communicated volumes without words. "That's not normal," John said quietly. "No," Dwayne agreed, his jaw tightening. "It's not." They turned just in time to see the man leading the girl away from the bench. His large frame nearly blocked her small body from view as he guided her along the path with purposeful steps. She remained eerily silent, her movements mechanical and precise, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The girl's feet struggled to keep pace with the man's longer strides, but she never stumbled, never complained, never made a sound. Her yellow dress fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, the cheerful color a sharp contrast to the darkness of the situation unfolding before them. "We need to follow them," John said, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that brooked no argument. Dwayne nodded without hesitation. "Let's go." They began moving again, but their casual morning jog had transformed into something else entirely. Now they were hunters, predators tracking prey, using skills they had never expected to need outside of wrestling rings and movie sets. They maintained a careful distance, blending into the steady stream of morning park-goers while keeping the man and girl in sight. The man walked with unmistakable purpose, his grip on the girl's wrist never loosening. Every few steps, he would glance around, scanning their surroundings with the practiced eye of someone checking for threats or witnesses. His movements were too controlled, too calculated for someone simply walking through a park with a family member. John felt his pulse quicken as adrenaline began flooding his system. The peaceful morning had shattered, replaced by something dark and urgent. The girl hadn't made a sound since they had started following, hadn't looked back, hadn't tried to signal again. Her silence was more disturbing than screams would have been. "He's in a hurry," John observed, keeping his tone casual despite the tension coiling in his muscles. Dwayne nodded, his sharp eyes tracking every movement. "And she's not talking, not even looking around." Something's definitely off. They continued their pursuit as the man led the girl toward the park's main exit. The bus stop came into view, a simple covered shelter where early commuters waited for their rides into the city. The man's pace increased slightly as they approached, his scan of the surroundings becoming more frequent and intense. John's training kicked in as he analyzed the situation. This wasn't a panicked kidnapper making desperate moves. This was someone following a plan, someone who had done this before. The thought made his stomach turn and his fists clench involuntarily. A city bus rumbled into view, its brakes hissing as it pulled up to the stop. The doors opened with a mechanical wheeze, and without hesitation, the man pushed the girl inside first. His large hand pressed firmly against her small shoulder as he guided her toward a seat near the back of the vehicle. John and Dwayne exchanged another loaded glance. "We're getting on that bus," John said, his voice carrying deadly serious intent. Dwayne nodded grimly. No sudden moves. They boarded quietly, each dropping bills into the fare box before moving toward the middle of the bus. The vehicle was half full with the usual collection of early morning passengers, an elderly woman scrolling through her phone, a construction worker staring blankly out the window, a teenager with headphones bobbing his head to unheard music, all of them oblivious to the life-and-death drama playing out just feet away. The man and girl had taken seats at the very back of the bus. John and Dwayne positioned themselves strategically, choosing seats at angles that allowed them to observe without being obvious about their surveillance. Up close, the girl's condition was even more heartbreaking. She sat pressed against the window, her posture rigid with fear, hands folded in her lap with fingers curled together as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. She didn't fidget, didn't move, didn't show any of the natural restlessness expected from a child her age. The man sat beside her, with one arm draped casually over the back of the seat, but his posture revealed the truth to anyone trained to look for it. He wasn't relaxed. He was guarding her, his head turned in small, controlled movements every few seconds, checking for threats, monitoring their surroundings with the hypervigilance of a predator protecting valuable prey. John studied the man's face more carefully now that they were closer. The sunglasses remained firmly in place, but he could see the sharp angles of his jawline, the way his mouth was set in a hard line, the nervous energy that manifested in fingers tapping against his knee in an impatient rhythm. This wasn't a father taking his daughter home. This was a dangerous man on high alert, and John knew with growing certainty that they were running out of time to act. The bus swayed gently as it navigated the city streets, but the movement did nothing to ease the tension crackling through the air. John watched from his seat as the man's fingers continued their nervous tapping against his knee, a steady rhythm that spoke of barely controlled anxiety. This was someone operating on edge, someone who knew he was being hunted even if he couldn't identify the hunters. Dwayne, sitting several rows ahead, made his move with the calculated precision of a master strategist. He rose from his seat with casual grace, stretching his massive arms above his head in a gesture that appeared completely natural. As he made his way toward the back of the bus, he wore the friendly expression that had charmed millions of fans worldwide. John held his breath as his partner positioned himself in the row, directly behind the man and girl. Dwayne's approach was perfect, curious, but non-threatening, the kind of interaction that happened on public transportation every day. "Hey there, kiddo," Dwayne said, his voice carrying its usual warm friendliness as he smiled down at the girl. "That's a nice dress. Yellow is a great color on you." The girl's reaction was subtle but telling. For half a second, her fingers twitched against her lap, a tiny movement that might have been the beginning of another signal. But then the man's grip tightened on her wrist, subtle, but unmistakably threatening. The message was clear: stay quiet, stay still, or face consequences. "She's shy," the man said smoothly, his voice calm but firm. There was no warmth in his tone, no parental affection. "We're just trying to get home." Dwayne nodded slowly, his trained eye catching the way the girl's breathing had become more controlled, more deliberate. She was fighting back tears, struggling to maintain the composure that had likely been beaten into her through fear and repetition. "Right," Dwayne replied easily. "Long day. Visiting family." the man answered without missing a beat. She's tired. The lies flowed smoothly from his lips, rehearsed responses delivered with practiced ease. John realized this man had answered these questions before, had perfected his cover story through repetition. How many times had he done this? How many other children had sat in that same seat, wearing that same expression of terrified compliance? John's hands clenched into fists as rage built in his chest. The girl was right there, less than 20 feet away, and he was helpless to act without potentially making things worse. One wrong move could spook the man into doing something desperate, something that might harm the child they were trying to save. When the bus lurched to its next stop, the man was ready. He hauled the girl to her feet before the doors had fully opened, his urgency barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of normalcy. His grip on her arm was firm enough to guide her, but careful enough not to leave visible marks that might draw attention. "They're getting off," Dwayne murmured, his gaze meeting John's across the bus. "So are we," John replied, already rising from his seat. They followed the pair onto the street, emerging into a part of the city that felt different from the peaceful park where this had all started. Here, the buildings were older, the streets narrower, and the foot traffic lighter. Small businesses lined the sidewalks, a corner grocery store with barred windows, a laundromat with flickering neon signs, a pawn shop displaying desperate treasures behind security glass. The man didn't pause to get his bearings. He turned immediately into a narrow alley that cut between two weathered buildings, his destination clearly planned in advance. The girl's small legs worked frantically to keep up with his longer strides as they moved deeper into the urban maze. "He's trying to disappear," John observed, his voice tight with urgency. Dwayne rolled his shoulders, loosening muscles that were already coiled for action. "Then we better not lose them." They picked up their pace, following the pair into the alley's mouth. The narrow passage was dimly lit despite the bright morning sun, shadows cast by the surrounding buildings creating pockets of darkness that could hide anything. The sounds of the city faded behind them, replaced by the echo of footsteps on cracked concrete and the distant drip of water from an unseen source. Then, without warning, everything changed. The man stopped walking. He turned around slowly, deliberately, facing them for the first time since this chase had begun. Even through his sunglasses, John could sense the cold calculation in his stare. He knew. He had known they were following him, had led them exactly where he wanted them to go. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" the man asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge beneath its superficial politeness. John and Dwayne came to a careful stop, maintaining the distance between them while assessing the situation. The alley stretched ahead, deeper into shadows, but behind them lay their only clear path to safety. They were in a narrow corridor with limited options, facing a man who had clearly planned this confrontation. The girl stood beside him, her small frame rigid with fear, hands trembling at her sides. She looked like she wanted to run to them, wanted to trust these strangers who had noticed her silent plea, but terror kept her frozen in place. "Just wanted to check if everything's okay here," John said evenly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority he had learned from years of handling hostile crowds. The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "What's it to you?" "Didn't seem like she wanted to go with you back at the bus stop," Dwayne added, crossing his arms in a gesture that emphasized his impressive physical presence. "She's shy," the man repeated, but his patience was clearly wearing thin. "Doesn't like strangers. We don't need any trouble. We've got places to be." He pulled on the girl's arm again, but John stepped directly into his path. "Hold up." The man's hand twitched, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Move." John didn't budge. Instead, he crouched down slightly, bringing himself to the girl's eye level. His voice softened, carrying the gentle tone he might use with a frightened animal. "Just one question, sweetheart. Is he really your family?" The girl's shoulders began to tremble. Her mouth opened slightly, and for a moment John thought she might remain silent, too terrified to speak the truth. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the word that changed everything. "No." The man cursed under his breath, his facade finally shattering completely. The game was over, the pretense abandoned. He yanked the girl behind him and tried to push past them both, But John was ready. "Not happening," John said, grabbing the man's arm with iron grip. That's when the shadows came alive. Two more figures emerged from the darkness deeper in the alley, their footsteps silent until they chose to reveal themselves. Both were large, built like enforcers, their expressions cold and professional. A third man appeared behind them, even bigger than the first two, his arms crossed over a chest that looked like it could stop bullets. Dwayne sighed heavily, shaking his head with the resignation of someone who had seen this particular movie before. Oh, great. John barely spared the newcomers a glance, his focus remaining locked on the man who still held the girl. "You really want to do this?" The man's smirk returned, confidence restored by the arrival of his backup. "I don't think you understand the situation. You should walk away." Dwayne let out a short chuckle, the sound echoing off the alley walls. "That's not going to happen." The biggest of the new arrivals took a slow, deliberate step forward, his massive frame blocking most of the light from the alley's entrance. "Then you're making a mistake." John's muscles coiled as he recognized the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This was organized, professional, and dangerous. The realization sent ice through his veins even as adrenaline began flooding his system. The man holding the girl gave one last attempt to maintain control. "You had your chance." John moved first, but he wouldn't be moving alone. The alley exploded into violence with the sudden, devastating force of a lightning strike. John's move came without warning. He grabbed the original man's wrist and twisted with the precise technique of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of controlled aggression. The grip on the girl's arm broke instantly, and she stumbled backward with a small gasp of surprise and relief. Dwayne was already in motion, pulling the frightened child safely behind his massive frame, while the larger confrontation erupted around them. His protective instincts kicked in with the same intensity that had driven him to excellence in every arena he had ever entered. The biggest of the newcomers lunged first, aiming a wild haymaker at Dwayne's head with the confident brutality of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents through size alone. But Dwayne had faced larger men than this, and he had never lost a fight that truly mattered. He sidestepped the punch with fluid grace, his massive arm shooting out to catch the attacker's wrist mid-swing. In one smooth, devastating motion, he twisted hard and fast. The sharp crack of breaking bone echoed off the alley walls, followed immediately by a grunt of pain as the man stumbled backward, cradling his injured arm. John barely had time to register his partner's swift victory before his own fight began in earnest. A wiry figure came at him from the side, moving with the quick, practiced precision of someone who relied on speed and surprise rather than brute force. The glint of steel caught the dim light as a knife traced a vicious arc through the air toward John's ribs. Years of training took over. John's body moved before his conscious mind could process the threat, muscle memory guiding his response. He dodged the first swipe by inches, feeling the blade's wind against his shirt, then caught the attacker's wrist with both hands and twisted with savage efficiency. The knife clattered to the concrete with a metallic ring that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. John drove his elbow into the man's ribs with calculated force, feeling the impact travel through his entire body. The attacker crumpled to his knees, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. But the original kidnapper wasn't finished. Taking advantage of the chaos, he reached for the girl again, desperation overriding caution as his careful plan disintegrated around him. His fingers stretched toward her wrist, seeking to reclaim his prize and use her as leverage in the escalating situation. The girl recoiled instinctively, fear flashing across her young face as she pressed herself against the alley wall. But before the man could get within arm's reach, Dwayne's imposing frame blocked his path completely. "Touch her again," Dwayne said, his voice dropping to a register that carried pure menace. "And you won't walk out of here." For the first time since this confrontation began, genuine fear flickered across the man's features. His carefully maintained composure cracked as he realized the situation had spun completely beyond his control. Another of his associates rushed forward, brandishing a pistol with the desperate aggression of someone who knew the fight was already lost. The weapon appeared with shocking suddenness, its presence transforming the alley into something far more deadly than a simple brawl. John saw the glint of metal a split second before the gun was raised. His body reacted before conscious thought could interfere, launching him forward in a tackle that would have made his old football coaches proud. He grabbed the gunman's wrist and shoved it skyward, just as the trigger was pulled. The gunshot rang out like thunder in the confined space, deafeningly loud and sharp enough to make everyone's ears ring. But the bullet buried itself harmlessly in the brick wall above their heads, sending chips of masonry raining down on the combatants below. Dwayne used the distraction to devastating effect. His massive fist connected with the gunman's jaw in a punch that carried every ounce of his professional training and personal fury. The man's head snapped sideways with sickening force before he crumpled to the ground like a marionette with severed strings. The pistol slipped from his nerveless fingers and went skittering across the broken concrete. John kicked the weapon away, sending it spinning into the shadows where it could do no more harm. The metallic scraping sound of its slide across the pavement provided a brief punctuation to the chaos. Two attackers remained standing, but their confidence had evaporated completely. The bigger one, still nursing his broken wrist, shifted uneasily as he realized the tide had turned decisively against them. His companion looked between the fallen bodies of his associates and the two men who had just demolished their entire operation with clinical efficiency. The largest attacker made one final desperate attempt, charging at Dwayne with the reckless fury of someone who had nothing left to lose. But Dwayne was ready for him. He planted his feet, caught the charging man in mid-rush, and lifted him clear off the ground with a roar of effort that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The impact when Dwayne slammed him down onto the concrete was devastating. The man hit the pavement with enough force to knock the wind completely out of his lungs, leaving him gasping and motionless beside his fallen companions. John turned toward the last man standing, the original kidnapper who had started this entire nightmare. The man's chest rose and fell rapidly, his face pale with the realization that he was completely outmatched and utterly alone. John wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, tasting copper but feeling no pain through the adrenaline coursing through his system. His gaze locked onto the kidnapper with unwavering intensity. "You're done." The man swallowed hard, looking around at his defeated associates scattered across the alley floor. For a moment, it seemed like he might try to run, might make one last desperate attempt to escape the consequences of his actions. But before he could move, the distinctive wail of sirens began to fill the air. Red and blue lights flickered against the alley walls, growing brighter by the second as multiple police vehicles converged on their location. John let out a long, slow breath, feeling some of the tension finally begin to leave his shoulders. Finally, the cavalry had arrived, and the nightmare was about to end. But as the sirens grew louder and the lights grew brighter, John looked down at the little girl who had started this entire chain of events. She was still pressed against the wall, still trembling, but there was something different in her eyes now. For the first time since he had seen her on that park bench, she looked like she believed she might actually be safe. The narrow alley transformed into a controlled chaos of flashing emergency lights and shouted commands. Police officers poured through the entrance with weapons drawn, their tactical boots creating a percussion of authority against the cracked concrete. The red and blue strobes painted the brick walls in alternating colors, turning the urban corridor into something that looked like a crime scene from a movie. John and Dwayne immediately raised their hands in a gesture of cooperation, stepping back from the scattered bodies of the defeated attackers. They had learned long ago that being large, powerful men in a volatile situation required careful attention to how they presented themselves to law enforcement. "Officers," John called out clearly, "we're the ones who called this in. The suspects are down and disarmed." The lead detective, a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had seen everything the city could throw at her, surveyed the scene with professional efficiency. Her gaze moved from the unconscious attackers to the discarded weapons to the two celebrities standing protectively near a frightened child. "Someone want to tell me what the hell happened here?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that demanded honest answers. The next several minutes passed in a blur of activity. Paramedics appeared to check the fallen men for serious injuries, while officers zip-tied their hands and read them their rights. The girl was wrapped in a soft blanket and guided to a police car where a specially trained child advocate waited to begin the delicate process of helping her feel safe enough to talk. John found himself recounting the morning's events for the third time, starting with the signal he had recognized in the park, and ending with the confrontation that had just concluded. Each telling made the reality of what had almost happened sink in more deeply. "The hand signal," the detective said, making notes in a worn notebook. "Most people wouldn't have recognized that." "I've done awareness campaigns," John explained. "Worked with organizations that teach people what to look for. When I saw it, I couldn't just walk away." Dwayne nodded agreement. Neither of us could. The detective's expression shifted as she received information through her radio earpiece. Her eyebrows rose slightly, and she looked at the handcuffed men with renewed interest. "Well, gentlemen," she said, "it looks like you stumbled into something much bigger than a simple kidnapping. We've been tracking a trafficking network for months, and this," she gestured toward the arrested men, "just gave us the break we needed." The words hit John like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something vast and organized, a network that destroyed children's lives for profit. The little girl they had saved was just one victim in a system designed to make innocence disappear. "How many others?" Dwayne asked quietly. "We don't know yet," the detective admitted. "But with what we've learned here today, we're going to find out." John walked over to where the girl sat in the back of the police car. She looked so small wrapped in the blanket, but there was something different about her now. The rigid terror that had defined her posture on the park bench was gone, replaced by the natural fidgeting of a normal child who had been through something traumatic, but was beginning to believe in safety again. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently, crouching down to her level. "You okay?" She nodded, though her voice was still small. "I think so. They're going to take really good care of you now. Make sure you get back where you belong." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. "I don't know if my family is even looking for me." John felt his chest tighten. The simple statement contained universes of pain and abandonment that no child should ever have to carry. He exchanged a glance with the child advocate, who nodded encouragingly. "We have people whose job is to find families," John told her. "Really good people who don't give up. And until they do, you'll be with people who will keep you safe. I promise." Dwayne stepped forward, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than intimidating in this context. "You're not alone anymore, kid. Not ever again." The girl sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Then, after a long pause filled with the sounds of police radios and distant traffic, she reached out and took John's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. John squeezed her fingers gently. "Always." As the police finished processing the scene and loading the arrested men into transport vehicles, John and Dwayne found themselves standing at the alley's entrance, watching the organized chaos wind down. The adrenaline was finally beginning to fade, leaving them both feeling the weight of what they had witnessed and participated in. "You know what the worst part is?" Dwayne said quietly. "What's that?" "If we hadn't been there, if we hadn't noticed that signal." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. John nodded, understanding completely. One missed glance, one moment of inattention, one decision to mind their own business, and that little girl would have vanished into a nightmare that might have lasted years or ended her life. "But we were there," John said firmly. "We did notice. And she's safe." "Yeah," Dwayne agreed, but his expression remained troubled. "How many others are out there right now, waiting for someone to notice them?" It was a question that would haunt both men in the days and weeks to come. They had saved one child, helped dismantle one operation, but they both knew it was just a fraction of a much larger problem. The detective approached them as the last of the police vehicles prepared to leave. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow for formal statements, but what you did here today, it's going to save a lot of lives." As they walked back toward the main street, leaving the alley and its shadows behind, John felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and responsibility settling over him. They had stumbled into this situation by accident, but they had chosen to act when action was needed. "You know," Dwayne said thoughtfully, "maybe this doesn't have to be the end." John looked at him questioningly. "I mean, we know what to look for now. We know these situations exist. Maybe we could do something more systematic. John considered this, remembering the fear in the girl's eyes and the relief when she realized she was finally safe. You thinking about starting some kind of foundation? Awareness campaign? Maybe, Dwayne said. Or maybe we just keep our eyes open. Keep running in that park. Keep paying attention to what's happening around us. Make sure we're ready if we see another signal. John smiled for the first time, since the morning had taken its dark turn. I like that idea. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, processing everything that had happened. The city continued its normal rhythms around them. People going to work, conducting business, living their lives unaware of the drama that had just played out in their midst. But John and Dwayne were different now. They had seen behind the veil of normalcy, glimpsed the predators who moved among innocent people, and they had chosen to fight back. They had become something they never expected to be. Real heroes, not just characters they played on screen. 2 weeks later, they found themselves back in the same park, following the same jogging route that had started everything. But now they ran with different eyes, watching for signs that most people would miss, ready to act if they saw another silent cry for help. And when they rounded that familiar curve near the bench where it all began, they saw her again. The little girl in the yellow dress, but different now, brighter, more animated, clearly well cared for and safe. She waved when she saw them, and for the first time since they had met her, she smiled. Sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary ones. A morning jog, a glance at a child on a bench, a decision to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. John and Dwayne approached the bench where the girl sat with what was clearly a social worker, a kind-faced woman with a clipboard and the patient demeanor of someone dedicated to helping children heal from trauma. The girl looked up as they approached, and her face lit up with genuine happiness. "Mr. John." "Mr. Dwayne," she called out, jumping up from the bench and running toward them with the natural enthusiasm that had been stolen from her just weeks before. John crouched down as she approached, opening his arms for the hug she clearly wanted to give. She wrapped her small arms around his neck and squeezed tight, and he felt something in his chest unclench, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Hey there, superstar," he said softly. "You look great." And she did. The rigid fear was gone from her posture, replaced by the normal fidgeting energy of a healthy child. Her eyes were bright and curious instead of wide with terror, and when she smiled, it reached all the way to those eyes. "I'm staying with a really nice family," she told them excitedly. "They have a dog named Buster, and he's huge but really gentle. And I'm going to start school next week." Dwayne grinned, ruffling her hair gently. "That's fantastic. Are you excited about school?" "Yeah, and my case worker says they're still looking for my real family. But if they can't find them, maybe the family I'm with now might want to adopt me." The words tumbled out in a rush, filled with hope and possibility. The social worker approached, extending her hand to both men. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I can't thank you enough for what you did. This little girl has made incredible progress, but she's been asking to see you both. She wanted to tell you something." They looked down at the girl, who suddenly seemed shy again. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and looked up at them with serious eyes. "I wanted to say thank you," she said carefully, as if she had practiced the words. "But also, I remember that signal you saw me make. My case worker taught me some other signals too, and she said maybe I could help teach other kids about them." John felt his throat tighten with emotion. This brave little girl wanted to turn her trauma into something that could help others, to make sure no other child would suffer what she had suffered. "That's an amazing idea," he told her. "Would you like some help with that?" Her eyes widened. "Really? You would help?" "Absolutely," Dwayne said without hesitation. "In fact, we've been thinking about starting something. A foundation, maybe, to teach people about these signals and how to help kids who need it." The social worker's face lit up with interest. "That would be incredible. The need for this kind of awareness is enormous, and having people like you involved could reach so many families, so many potential rescuers." Over the next hour, sitting on that same bench where their story had begun, they talked about possibilities. The girl, whose name was Maya. They learned, shared ideas with the wisdom of someone who had lived through darkness and emerged into light. She talked about how scared she had been, how she had learned the signal from another girl in the place where she was held, how she had almost given up hope that anyone would notice. "But you did notice," she said simply. "And now I'm safe, and I want other kids to be safe too." As their conversation wound down, and it came time to say goodbye, Maya hugged both men again. But this time, there was something different about the embrace. It wasn't desperate or clinging, but grateful and confident. She was a child who knew she was loved and protected, who had a future to look forward to. "I'll see you soon, right?" she asked. "For the foundation thing?" "Absolutely," John promised. "We're going to do this together." As Maya walked away with her social worker, skipping slightly and chattering about her new life, John and Dwayne resumed their jog. But the rhythm felt different now, purposeful in a way that went beyond physical fitness. "So," Dwayne said as they picked up their pace, "I guess we're starting a foundation." John grinned, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I guess we are." They ran in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in thoughts about the future they were about to build. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting the same dappled shadows on the path that had been there the day they first saw Maya. But everything else had changed. They had learned that heroism wasn't about stage fights in wrestling rings or action sequences in movies. Real heroism was about paying attention when others looked away, about acting when action was needed, about turning personal experience into something that could help others. As they rounded the final curve of their route, John thought about all the children out there who might need someone to notice their silent signals. He thought about the families who might learn to recognize signs of trouble, about the communities that could be taught to watch out for their most vulnerable members. The foundation they would build, Maya's foundation, they had already decided, would teach the hand signal that had started it all. But more than that, it would teach people to trust their instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong, to believe that one person's actions really could change everything for someone in desperate need. Their morning jog had become something neither man had expected when they started running together months ago. It had become the beginning of a mission that would define the rest of their lives, not as entertainers or athletes, but as protectors of the innocent, as guardians watching for silent cries for help. And every morning when they laced up their running shoes and headed out into the world, they carried with them the knowledge that somewhere out there, another child might be waiting on another bench, hoping that someone would notice, someone would care, someone would act. They would be ready, because sometimes a simple morning jog really can change everything, not just for the runners, but for every life they touch along the way. Maya had taught them that heroism isn't about the size of your muscles or the number of people cheering for you. It's about the size of your heart and your willingness to use whatever strength you have to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The sun climbed higher, the city came alive around them, and John Cena and Dwayne Johnson continued their run, not just through the park, but toward a future where no child's silent signal would go unnoticed, where every cry for help would be answered, where the simple act of paying attention could save lives. Their story had begun with a glance, a signal, and a choice to act. It would continue with every life they touched, every signal they taught, every child they helped save. The morning jog was over, but their real work had just begun.